Welcome to Courageous Dialogues, podcast where I try and get to the heart of the matter with people in your community. In this episode of Courageous Dialogues, I speak with Simon Davies, the Director of Safeguarding Services. He's a former Australian Federal Police detective and is highly recognised and nationally awarded for investigations, safeguarding children and young people, complaint management, conflict resolution, and employee misconduct. We speak about child safety standards and what it means for schools. So thank you for coming on Courageous Dialogues.
No, that's okay. Thank you for having me.
So you're the Director of Safeguarding
Services,
yeah.
So
your LinkedIn didn't lie.
No, LinkedIn's correct. I've never lied on LinkedIn like most people.
Very good. And you're a former Australian Federal
Police detective.
Detective?
So I was with the Australian Federal Police for around 14 years, with a majority of my career spent in the counter-terrorism teams there. So for 7 years I did that in some pretty high profile and sort of secretive work. And then I was in internal investigations for a number of years, so investigating police and their misconduct. And then I finished up as the team leader of data and telecommunications interception, so listening to people's phones and running a team of people that do that. And then sort of, wasn't particularly looking at leaving the police. I really enjoyed it, but an opportunity came up at Catholic Education Melbourne, as it was known then, and the Royal Commission had just started into child sexual abuse in institutions. And I thought, oh, well, that sounds interesting. I'll see what that's about, and went along for the interview more just out of interest than sort of really wanting the job, and was offered the job on the spot, and sort of thought, okay, well, I'll take some leave of absence from the police and see what this job's about and whether I like it. So I was in a very fortunate position that I could do that. I had the best of both worlds, really, and liked it, and then left the police formally, and stayed with Catholic Education for a number of years, as you know, doing misconduct of teachers around the system, so around 30,000 something teachers in Melbourne. And then was headhunted by the Jesuits to be their Director of Professional Standards for the Australian province, and have done that for the sort of 6 years, 6.5 years. And then during that time, I decided to start my own consultancy as well. So started Safeguarding Services, and that was in 2017. And now I'm just doing that full time, and we've expanded and grown over that period as well.
Okay, there's so much in what you just said. I have to ask the first thing I need to ask is, when you were listening to those phone calls, did you ever say, "Oh, come on, don't lie"?
It's interesting. It's a funny job because I actually had to recruit for a lot of people for that role, and you need a certain type of person that how would you describe them? It's the person that is happy to. Because really, you think of how many phone calls you might make in a year. It might be, thousands, and most of them are pretty mundane and boring. Around, you might call your partner and say, "Can you pick up the milk on the way home?" It's listening for that gold. So you need someone who has high attention to detail and high. Can maintain that attention span for a long period of time, waiting for that piece of gold and listen to all the mundane conversations in between. So it takes a certain type of person. It's an interesting role.
That's not me.
No, it can get very boring at times.
Come on, finish your conversation and move on.
That's it.
So we crossed paths at Catholic Ed, and that was around the time of the Royal Commission. Was this the start? I'm pretty sure this was the start of the whole inquiry and the whole introduction, I guess, to safe standards and standards, child safety standards. Is that correct? It'd be about 2000.
Look, a little bit.
14, 15, yeah.
It was about 2016, but 2014. But prior to that, Victoria had actually, to their credit, they'd sort of kicked off the whole thing. They had a state parliamentary inquiry into child abuse in institutions. So it was sort of a mini Royal Commission, if you like, in Victoria. And that was quite interesting itself. And really the standards in Victoria came out of that inquiry, not out of the Royal Commission. So in my view, across Australia, sort of Victoria's always been ahead of the game. In fact, it's only just now that New South Wales has started introducing standards, sort of for 6 years after Victoria have, so quite behind the 8 ball there. Victoria's always been gold standard in that sense of child safe standards and reportable conduct schemes and all the other child safety measures are in place.
Mm-hmm. So it's a few days after where the standards have been enacted in all states and territories.
Well, not really, actually. So that's a bit of a misnomer as well. There's the child safe national principles, which came out of the Royal Commission, and COAG have agreed to those principles. But that's all they really are, is principles. There's no, in a lot of states, there's no legislation to say that they have to be enacted, which is sad. It's really only in New South Wales and Victoria that have sort of gone, okay, well, we want to put some meat on the bone here and introduce these standards as mandatory, and have penalties apply to organisations that don't implement them. There's a long way still to go across Australia with these sorts of things. Yeah.
That's a real shame, because if you look at the principles, and the stats, we need to be hitting other states. I'm currently in Darwin, for example. So, those sort of principles and standards should actually be enacted. So I'm actually quite surprised about that.
It's a bit sad, and
in those standards, principles, there was an article, it was talking about the wellbeing aspect. I think you came across the article, and that's how I actually saw it as well, in terms of what that looks like.
It's really interesting. I was actually, just before I went to Rome, I was presenting to I think they're called the Peninsula Network of Principles, around the standards. And the discussion I always find interesting talking to wellbeing people is, and I've just been up in the Diocese of Wagga Wagga doing quite a big review for them around safeguarding. And what I find often is the wellbeing people get lumped with safeguarding and child protection and things like that. And I see them as actually quite separate. I sort of think, I see safeguarding and child protection as that physical element that, we need to keep kids physically safe. Also mentally, obviously, you don't want a teacher shouting at them or anything like that. So there's that sort of, the way I perceive it in my brain is that sort of physical, environmental safety, if you like, and well-being is a very different beast in itself. It's that, mental health around peer relationships and things like that. And it sort of, it infuriates me a little when the two are sort of just put together. It's almost, within a school, we need to put safeguarding somewhere, we'll just give it to the wellbeing people and they get loaded up. And I sort of think, well, they're two very different skill sets, and it's a lot to put on the wellbeing people. So I'd like to, out of conversations like this and other work, is to sort of get people to see the difference between the two and sort of separate them out. And often to educational institutions, I recommend sort of safeguarding should sit with either sort of a deputy principal or principal. They should be the leaders of this sort of stuff. It shouldn't be the wellbeing people.
Yeah, so one of the key things for me coming back into education is bridging that gap, because you are right, in most schools they separate, sort of the learning teaching as well to the well-being. So it's bringing those two groups together and saying, actually, it's all together. So you can't have, the high achievers when the well-being and the relationships just isn't right. So you've got to be all in this. So I guess that leads me to sort of the work that schools should be looking at. One of the things that I'm passionate about is emotional intelligence and understanding, how you react and the impact that you have on others. And we don't really sort of, I mean, we do have base level programs in secondary school, but we don't really do a lot of that sort of work in schools. So I guess my question is, would you suggest that that's probably the work that we need to be looking at?
It's interesting, but I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from you. I shouldn't interview you, but you know, is EQ or increasing someone's EQ something that can be taught, or is it you know, in a person or not? Is it a skill that can be taught?
I think just understanding who you are and your triggers and how you react. I think the understanding can be taught in terms of the self-awareness, in terms of, you know, how you can impact on someone's day, you know, with just a word or a look or a gesture. So those sorts of things can be taught. In terms of what you're suggesting, probably not.
Yeah.
I
do. It's interesting how that relates, though, to child safety. In sort of my work, after seeing, sadly, a lot of historic cases of child abuse, it would appear to me, yeah, and this is a bit of well, it's not a generalisation. It's through evidence-based, you know, and through my own experience, is that a lot of the victims of child abuse have been, I would say, kids that lacked resilience, were from you know, broken home environments, not your typical, you know, sport high achiever sort of kid. They were the sort of quiet ones in the class, or single mum family, or you know, had a few issues going on at school, or had a few issues going on at home. So much so that I remember a couple of years ago, I suggested to a PhD student that they approach their professor and say, look, can they do their PhD on studies of victims rather than studies of perpetrators? And sadly, there's a million studies done on perpetrators, but I've never seen a study done on victims. So, and I sort of think if you had a baseline test or some measures that schools could say, okay, within say a year 8 cohort, here's 3 students we've identified at risk, be that because, you know, they come from a single mum family, or they've got, you know, dad just died, or they're not that confident, or they've got other issues going on, you know, a bit of a matrix to sort of identify those students. And then you know, teaching teams can be aware of those 3 students within that cohort and sort of keep a closer eye on them than they probably would have, and with a different lens. So not keeping an eye on them from a wellbeing perspective, but that's important, but also keeping them eye from another perspective to say, well, could they be targeted by another staff member or someone else within the community?
Yeah.
But so yeah,
that's
so I
interesting. So there's okay.
Yeah.
That is really interesting. I would have thought that they would have done studies on victims.
No, there's well, studies, lots of studies around, you know, the impacts of child abuse on victims and all of that sort of stuff, but not from that preventative perspective of, you know, how do we identify a victim before they become a victim, and that sort of typology, if you like. But I think, going back to what you were saying around teaching kids about themselves, I think that sort of leads into it. It's about you know, building stronger, more resilient, you know, more confident kids that aren't victims on multiple levels. You know, aren't victims of bullying, aren't victims of, you know, harassment and all the rest of it, but also at the sharp end, not victims of child abuse either.
Okay. So you just missed a conference in Rome. You actually got to Rome, got COVID.
Yeah.
It's a conference from people all around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about the conference? And you obviously streamed it.
Yeah. So I'm one of the organisers. It's a conference that's been running for around 20 years. It was previously known as the Anglophone Conference. So it's a Catholic Church-based conference that brings English, well, previously brought English-speaking people together within the church around child safety and safeguarding. But for the past couple of years, we've gone broader than that, because the organisers sort of felt that, well, a lot of the issues, probably the more serious issues, are occurring in the non-English speaking countries. And we felt it was important that they be included in the conversation as well. So for the past couple of years, we've run it online because of COVID, but this was the first time we've run it in person in Rome. And we had about 90 people there, clergy, lay people who do similar jobs to myself, from various nations, African, Asian nations. We had a lot of South Americans there from Mexico and other countries, and really rich dialogue around the challenges that they're all facing in their particular context, and frustrations with church trying to implement global documents that don't really suit particular narratives or contexts. So yeah, it's as you know, Tanya, those conferences, it's more around the networking and in the margins there, people having conversations on the side and what have you. But some of the key takeaways from me were, there's still in a lot of cultures this this secrecy, if you like, within families, that the priest or teachers and people in sort of senior positions are very well respected, to a point that if they offend, the family would rather keep that quiet and not embarrass the family or not embarrass the offender, which is quite sad to think that that's still occurring today. But they're the sort of barriers that we need to recognise. That we're in a pretty good position here in Australia. I think now we've had a Royal Commission. We've sort of there's the Me Too movement. We've sort of everyone's talking more about these sort of issues, but there's a lot of countries where a lot of kids are very unsafe today.
So I remember an experience that I had as a new graduate going into a school where it was very multicultural. So students had moved from countries where they've, for safety reasons, and then I've got a class full of kids from different nationalities and backgrounds, and the cultures and the values are very different, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So if you've got a classroom and nearly every single student is from another country and with different values and traditions and all of that, we did some really good professional learning around poverty and around understanding refugees, and what they've had to come through to get to Australia. But it doesn't dawn on you, because I had this one experience where I had a parent-teacher interview, and I thought I wasn't hard on the student at all. I just said could try a little bit harder. And then the following day, I had the experience where the student actually came into the room, and he looked really sad, and I said, "What's going on?" And then he showed me his back, and it was based on the conversation that I had with the parents, and it was all I said was, needs to try a little bit harder. And for me, that was really the key point in terms of making sure that I understood the cultures of all of the students in my classroom, and just even how to communicate things, not to the point where I'm saying they're terrific, but just making sure that communication is read well, that it doesn't have an impact on home. So I imagine that we still have a lot of cases with that, with Australia being very multicultural.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can think of an example when I was at Catholic Education, that a principal even of a sort of a particular culture was dominant within that school, and an issue had occurred in the home. It was a clear mandatory reporting obligation on the principal, who'd become aware of this situation at home, but she did not want to report it because of the cultural implications on the family of that report, etc. So yeah, there's certainly live issues within the Australian culture and the diaspora that exists, within our wonderful nation. But I think equally, it's interesting. My wife's just started a new job working with refugees, and I think whilst there's some onus on teachers and others to become aware of the cultures that exist and the sort of interplay there that you've talked about, I think how do we then too educate those families to say, well, when Tanya says that, it doesn't mean this, but whose obligation is that? Whose responsibility is it? There's enough on the school as it is to then have to educate families in the cultural context of Australia as well. But it's a very live issue. In fact, I've got a live investigation at the moment where, what I would deem as fairly low level sort of behaviours, the family, I think, from a cultural perspective, are deeming them as quite severe and what have you. So, yeah, it's interesting to see the cultural perspectives that exist. And we may just assume that everyone's on the same page and that it's all the same, but it can be very different in different households.
Can we touch on the mandatory reporting? Because I've had to over the years, and it's become a lot easier in terms of the process. And, back in the day, you had to provide so much information, and there'd be like lots of follow-up and all of that sort of gear. There's still follow-up these days, but the process is a lot easier. But there are still some people that are reluctant to report. Do you have any information on that? Why would they be reluctant to report?
I think there's a reluctance to, well, I think from the blowback position that they're concerned probably that, I'm going to get dad or mum up in my grill, as they say, on Monday morning, because I've made a report about something I've observed on their child. I think, I think that's quite a common Australian phenomenon, if you like. Don't dob in someone. There's that sort of culture that exists in our country, but also people are worried about the consequences that may come from making that report as well. And what if I'm wrong? People worry about that as well. I've observed this, or the child said this, but what if they're lying? What if I'm wrong? I'm besmirching that family's name if I'm incorrect. So there's all those things that I think play through a mandatory reporter's head. But I think they need to, within themselves, get past that and say, well, there's a higher priority here, which is the potential harm that may occur to that child if I don't report it. Yeah.
I did some fantastic training with someone at our school recently, and her keywords were, and I hope everyone was listening, if you're unsure, you should report. If you're unsure of anything, just report. Everything else,
Yeah, I've heard the catchphrase, if in doubt, call it out, is used in training. And I think that's true. And, interestingly, I remember when the Reportable Conduct scheme started in Victoria, the Commission noticed that reports went through the roof. And I think because people were unsure, they were sort of jumping at shadows and sort of over-reporting. But now that's leveled off. People then get an understanding of a system or what's required of them. But there is that worry. I think too, there's a worry for me when I go into schools is I see this lack of understanding of the difference between the two. A lot of people confuse reportable conduct and mandatory reporting. And I find, and I don't blame teachers for that, because, their primary purpose is teaching. It's not about, reporting issues. But it's concerning that there isn't that confidence or that clear understanding of what the difference is between the two.
Yeah, I had a stat here and I can't find it now, but the stats have increased in terms of abuse and neglect, especially over, I think it was 2019 and 20. Is it because more people are reporting?
I think probably more people are reporting, but I think probably COVID would have an impact on that as well. I used to sit on a panel, a child safeguarding panel with the City of Melbourne, and they noticed that over COVID there were a lot of reports, to the point that they'd actually made a way for mums to be able to report covertly when they come to their maternal child health care nurse meetings, because that might have been their only opportunity to get out of the house, a violent household, for 3 months because of lockdowns in Victoria. So they implemented sort of a code word system for mums to be able to covertly report to the nurse, even if sort of dad was there, that something was going on and it needed attention. But I certainly think COVID had an impact on people being at home. Tempers get conflated. People aren't getting that break to go to work away from the kids. Like, I know myself, the four of us, so my two children, my wife and I, were all in the house for pretty much 18 months straight, which I think, that's a lot of pressure on people. And when you've already got an element of violence in the home, that's just, you're conflating the issue.
I remember with the initial onset with COVID, and I was looking at, for the school that I was at, in terms of, turning those video cameras on or not. For the classroom teacher. And we made the decision because, I spoke with the e-safety commissioner at the time. There was nothing sort of in place. So we had to do a lot of work with the community to say, look, we are going to be turning on the video cameras. And we did a lot of sessions with the students and the parents in terms of, where to set up and what to make sure in terms of your surroundings in the background, and all of that. Did we see, what do I want to ask? Because I know a lot of schools were concerned, and a lot of schools went down the track where we're not turning that video camera on. And I know when I moved schools, they had actually enforced the no video rule, but then for last year, we actually had the videos on, but because of the previous year, some students weren't turning theirs on. What was the impact? Has there been any reports in terms of, videos on, videos off, increase in terms of reports?
I think anecdotally, I can just say from our perspective, in fact, when sort of COVID hit, we're little bit worried, and this is a terrible thing to say, but our business is child safety, and at the sharp end, our business is investigation. So we were a bit worried that because students weren't predominantly in the classroom, that our business would have dropped off. But actually, we noticed that the business in the investigations area stayed constant, because what we found was there were complaints around parents being concerned about that one-on-one interaction with a teacher. So instead of, if you think of it, good practice is, to have that glass door or oversight, or you're having a conversation one-on-one with a student where there's sort of that natural oversight. Whereas in this environment, teachers were having the conversation because it was convenient to have it online, not recording the conversation, and then allegations were being made against the teacher about an inappropriate conversation, perhaps online. So we actually noticed, our business didn't subside. It just, I guess, pivoted, to use that terrible word that everyone uses during COVID. It was more conversational based and inappropriate interactions with students rather than sort of any physical harm. But the sort of the stats stayed as a constant. So I think, schools hadn't really considered, I think, it was so rushed, the rollout of COVID and trying to cope with the situation, that schools probably hadn't really considered, or they'd more considered it from from a pedagogical perspective, how can we teach well online and pivot to that environment? How can we be mindful of kids' safety at home, where the perpetrator might be the parent? But I don't think they put a lot of thought into how can we protect our staff? How can we make sure that if there are allegations made, that there's some protections from those for staff online? Like, I know some schools had mandatory that any one-on-one conversation with a child had to be recorded, and that was good, but a lot didn't.
Yeah. Okay. So we had breakout rooms that, and everything was recorded. So we did put in some boundaries, and that was actually came from the teachers. Some teachers were, when we were thinking about this and putting together the structures, we actually had teachers saying we're not comfortable zooming into, the students' family
Bedroom.
home. Yeah. So there was a lot of sort of education around that, and all the reasons that you just mentioned. We're returning the videos on. So yeah, I was very curious about that. So I am curious about another thing, because I'm secondary based. With these new standards, let's say we've got year 10, year 11, year 12 students that go to work experience and organisations. Let's just say I've got a year 10 student going to a building with 500 people in there to do work experience, predominantly with one person. How tight are the rules around that, and what do schools need to think about?
Well, so I think schools need to, well, two things. I think whilst it's auspiced by the school, the child is going into the, I guess, environment of that workplace. So there's a level of onus on the workplace where the child's going to be mindful that they've got a minor on site, and they're working with that student. You can't 100% say, okay, the school's then washed its hands of all responsibility of that child. But on the flip side too, you can't, if something did go wrong, you can't necessarily, I don't think, hold the school 100% to account either. They can't, if they're not there supervising the child, well, they can't be held responsible for that. But I think what schools can do is, it may be in the form of a flyer or a letter that goes to the employer to say, look, these are some of the things you need to be mindful of. You are working with a minor. You need to be mindful of what's said to the child, or what conversations they're going to be exposed to, what environments they're going to be exposed to, et cetera, et cetera. So no different to, we just talked about having a one-on-one conversation with the child, that there's some natural oversight, or that's in an open area, et cetera. They might be little hints or tips that might be provided to an employer to say, if you are having a one-on-one conversation with this child, that maybe you might want to consider doing that in an open environment, or where other people are present, et cetera.
Okay. And then sort of that lends itself to sporting events. So I've got a picture of, that's just a park run that we go to. But sporting events like SIS sports and everything like that, what do schools need to think about when you've got, kids going to different schools, and maybe parent volunteers? I guess they need to see the working with children's check, but is there anything else that they need to be doing in those situations?
Yeah, look, I always think, when I talk to schools, I always look at who's sort of in charge, or who's got carriage of the children at that point in time. And I imagine in those sort of sporting environments, it's you, say, as a supervising teacher, taking a group of students to another school. And even though it's off-site, they're still in your custody and control. So all responsibility sort of falls to your school around those students. So I often say, well, what would you do on your campus needs to apply what you do off-site as well. There needs to be just as many checks and balances, if not more so, because you do have other people coming in that you may not be aware of. You may not be confident that they've been checked. I think we make a lot of assumptions that other schools are run as well as my school is, or that they're doing as much checking as I am. But I think you need to sort of more come at it with a lowest common denominator perspective, to say, well, what if they haven't done the level of checking that I have? I need to, I need to be more heightened here if I'm in an offsite environment with children.
Mm-hmm. So this is Courageous Dialogues. Can you tell me a time where you've been courageous in either your work or personal?
Oh, look, I suppose in the police, you had to be most days, but that's an easy answer, I guess. Courage is an interesting thing. I think where I see courage in a normal environment, I won't talk about the police because that's easy, but I think in a normal environment is around having courageous dialogues with people. I think pulling people up, I think, is the thing that I see we're lacking in society. I think it's seen as a negative thing, sadly, but I think it's actually, if you can turn around and see it as a positive, because if people aren't told, they don't learn. And I think too often, certainly in workplaces and probably schools as well, we're too scared of the fallout. That, if we, for instance, you and I, Tanya, were work colleagues, I'm too fearful of saying, well, what you're doing there probably isn't great, or the way you spoke to that customer wasn't great, so, but a lot of people, avoid those conversations, which either leads to you becoming more entrenched in your bad behavior. And from a sales perspective, we lose customers and all the rest of it. But also too, there's a lot of resentment there in your co-workers because they're just seeing you get away with that bad behavior as well, and you're not called on it. So I think for me, courage, can come in that area, and I see it really lacking that. And I don't know, not to be controversial, but I think society maybe to a level has gone a long way this way on the sort of spectrum, and I think as a result it's leading to a society that doesn't have conversations with people. How often now do people just send text messages because they don't want to have a conversation with someone? Sorry, it's my dogs. I think we need to have that courage to have real, frank conversations with people, whether that's with friends or whether that's with co-workers or colleagues. I think it's really important. And, sometimes I get called out for that. I don't think I'm courageous at all, but I think sometimes that can get me in hot water, having those direct conversations with people, but I stand by it. I think they're very important.
Thank you.